Overnights with Darryl Morris on talkRADIO.
Hello, good morning. It's talkRADIO Monday morning. So we're going to turn our attention to what happens next. Where do we go from here in terms of, I guess, everything, our social structures, the economy? I think if we're honest with ourselves, we need to start to do things differently, or we need to at least look at how we navigate through this that doesn't leave people behind, and that doesn't betray how different I think things are going to be for a lot of people in the next couple of months and years. So let's start on that topic with Mark Thomas, who is a business leader and an author of a couple of books on this issue. Really looking forward to this. Really fascinating take from him on how we do things differently, economically particularly, with his eye on a post-coronavirus world. Let's speak to Mark right now. Mark, hi. How big is the chance that we have now to hit reset here and do something differently?
Well, I think we have got a real chance, but I don't think it's at all easy to hit the button, because I think there are a lot of people trying to hit another button which is going to take us in a different direction. So I don't think there's any room whatsoever for complacency.
Okay, you said other people trying to hit another button to take us in a different direction. Who are they, and what direction are they taking us in? Well,
there's a philosophy of life which the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, described as market fundamentalism. And it's like religious fundamentalism in that it dominates the way you look at the world. If you're a market fundamentalist, you believe that what the market says is right. So if I'm richer than you, it's actually because I'm a higher value person. I've added more value to society and I deserve it. And if you're poor, that's because you're a low value person and you don't deserve it. And anything that gets in the way of the market making its allocation of resources is a bad thing. And that includes, for example, state provision of goods and services. So if you're a market fundamentalist, having a very expensive service like the NHS provided outside the market is wrong. It means that high-value, productive people are paying taxes to pay for the healthcare for poor, which means low-value people, and that's just not fair. And that philosophy is unfortunately very prevalent, and there are several people in our current cabinet who are market fundamentalists. So that's why the danger is so great now.
Right. And so here we are now in the greatest example that any of us are going to get, that idea and that philosophy.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, true. Absolutely. I think it's really highlighted that the people who actually keep us alive are people who are not well paid. So, all the frontline medics, typically not well paid. All the people who manage our food supply, from farm labourers to checkout operators in the supermarket, all those people are typically paid actually below £25,000, which is the kind of cut-off that the government has drawn for low-value people in the new immigration system. And suddenly it's become very visible that it's the low-value people that keep us alive. So we wouldn't be alive in a world without farmers and doctors and nurses, but we could, in fact, survive in a world without hedge fund managers.
Okay, so and the argument that they will make about that is that I guess that they are wealth creators, and that you can't have all of that other stuff without a focus on them first.
And interestingly enough, if you dig into the data, you find that's the opposite of the truth. So if you look at the period from the end of the Second World War up to 2015, when I started writing the book, that splits into two 35-year periods. The first of those was the golden age of capitalism. And actually what we had in that period was much higher growth. The economy was growing much faster. People's wages and salaries were growing much faster. Inequality was much lower. Actually, tax rates at the top end were higher than now, and it worked much better for almost everybody. It wasn't a very good period if you were extremely wealthy. because your wealth was growing more slowly than other people's. But for normal people, that was, and that's why it's called, the golden age of capitalism. Since 1980 in the US and the UK, we've been drifting towards this market fundamentalist idea, and the growth overall has been much lower. In fact, growth per capita in the last 10 years has been very, very close to zero. So this is a system which is failing on almost every measure now. But still, a tiny number of people are managing to get wealthier at about 6% per annum, even though most people are now poorer than they were in 2007. So that's what we've called mass impoverishment. Many, many people, a big proportion of the population, are actually getting poorer year on year. And this is the first generation which now can expect to be poorer than its parents if nothing changes.
Okay, and there's the big bit, if nothing changes. And we've talked a lot in this period about this trade-off between lives and livelihoods, and how that's an inevitability, and how that is a trade-off that we have to make. And, I mean, I would wonder if you agree with me, Mark. I've argued that we shouldn't have to make that trade-off, that actually there isn't as big a decision to be made here, and that we should have the will to do both of those things.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. The idea that there's some sort of trade-off that you can make where you unlock quickly and get the economy moving, and somehow that's going to be better for the economy and it's worth the loss of lives is just a nonsense, actually. It's the only way you could get the economy moving faster would be if you were to be absolutely reckless and just effectively do nothing to prevent the spread of the virus. If that happened, we would have an enormous second spike. The NHS would be completely overwhelmed, which means then you would have your grandmother would be dying at home without medical support. It would be absolute carnage. We would have chosen to have more casualties than the UK had during the whole of the Second World War, just in order to give a short-term boost to the economy. And I'm very doubtful that it would give any meaningful boost to the economy either. Yeah. So the idea that there's a meaningful trade-off is nonsense.
So you're saying that this sort of tentative easing that we've kind of been sold, and this idea of tentatively getting the economy back moving again, and that being kind of worth the trade-off, isn't accurate. That's not right.
No, I think it's premature, and most medics think so. The reason it's a bad idea is because it's doubly bad, actually, because it's bad in terms of containing the virus, and it means more people will die in total, but it also means that you don't contain it. So it's not actually, the numbers are not decreasing. We'll be in some form of lockdown forever with this kind of approach, or at least well into next year, which is going to be hugely harmful to the economy as well. So this is a double whammy. This is almost the stupidest thing that could be done.
We're asking some big questions, some searching questions about how we climb out of this, and how we pay down the debts that we've needed to accumulate in order to get us through this period, to carry some people through this period, and how we...
So that's something we've been looking at very closely recently. And the answer is, if you look at the last 300 years of history of debt, there has never been a year when we've managed to reduce the ratio of debt to GDP without fast economic growth. There is no way out of high debt other than boosting economic growth. And therefore what we need is a government which is prepared to be courageous and invest in economic growth and not really worry about short-term debt levels at all.
Okay, and that's a really hard argument to make, isn't it, Mark? I can feel
the opposite so many times.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me put this into. Let me sort of act on behalf of the audience. How I can feel them pushing back against that, calling out socialism. You know, calling you a leftist, calling you anti-capitalist, wanting to drag down the system. They'll be pushing back against that. What's your argument?
Well, I would say all of those points are wrong. So first of all, I've been accused of many things, but never been anti-capitalist. What I would say is there are different forms of capitalism, and, if you look around the world, there are over 200 countries. They all run slightly differently, and some of them have much better results in terms of how they treat their populations, what the median income is, what the growth in the economy is, what the life expectancy is, what the poverty rates are, how social mobility works. And if you look, you find actually fairly consistently the best performers on all those measures that I've just mentioned are the Nordic countries. And they're all capitalist. They all have actually a mixed economy, as indeed we do, where you have some services provided by the state and you have some provided by the private sector. And actually, it seems that a strong, balanced economy is the best thing to do. So the idea that you can do without capitalism, there is no evidence anywhere in the world for that. But equally, the idea that you can do without a strong state provision and still have an effective country is also not supported by any data anywhere in the world.
What does investment look like then, Mark? Give that some context. What are you talking about?
Well, there are all sorts of investment that actually are what in business terms you would say is a good investment. And of course, the thing about the definition of a good investment is that it pays for itself. So all you have to do if you made a good investment is to wait and you will get your money back in spades. So for example, the UK government used to invest a lot more in fundamental research and all sorts of things that we now take for granted. We forget were originally funded by state spending on research. We wouldn't have computers, we wouldn't have mobile phones if it weren't for state spending on research. So that sort of thing, that sort of spending is enormously good for the future growth of the economy, and we've been winding it down dramatically. And that's, of course, just a false economy to save in that sort of way. With flood defences, the government saved, in inverted commas, a few £100 million on flood defences, because they said that was prudent financial management, but then £5 billion worth of damage were done by the floods. Well, that's not sensible. That's like me saying, yes, I know I've got a leaky roof, but I'm going to be prudent, so I'm not going to fix it, and I'll just let the rain come in and we'll see what happens when the dry rot starts. It's not straight thinking. It's not the way a business person would run the economy.
You touched on it a little bit then, Mark, about how we've been sold the other idea for such a long time now that it's really taken root and it's really taken hold. And it's going to make that, your argument's quite a hard one to convince people of, or it seems to be.
Well,
it seems to have been.
It's actually hard, and that's why I wrote the book, because what I found was that we all, and I include myself in that, have been told some of these things so many times that we find it very difficult to believe they might not be true. And it's when I put it down on paper, I found people would read the book, and then when they saw the facts, then they were able to change their minds. But it's difficult when you're just listening to somebody. So, for example, why did we have austerity? Well, we had austerity because we were told that the level of debt to GDP in this country had reached ruinous levels and we would bankrupt our children if we didn't immediately embark on austerity. And of course what happened is we did embark on austerity and we had very low growth, and as I said before, there's never been any example in our 300 years of recorded history of this where low growth enables you to reduce the debt rate, and therefore it didn't enable us to reduce the debt rate. And the original justification for it was essentially untrue, because even now, and it's higher than it was at the time austerity started, the level of government debt to GDP isn't high. It's not staggeringly high. It's not even slightly high. It's just coming up to the average of the last 300 years. So we've had below average debt all this time, and it was used as the cover for austerity. But because we've all heard it so many times that the debt was high, there's no money left, there's no magic money tree, you can't go on living beyond your means. We've heard all these things so many times, and it begins to sound reasonable. And it's only when you look at the numbers that you realize, yes, the words sound reasonable, but the numbers tell you a completely different story.
And there's a whole sorts of there's all sorts of stuff in that in the engine of making that happen, isn't there, Mark? Like the characters that are involved on that side of the argument perhaps being more convincing, the narrative that was created, the stories that were told, the people's individual fears that were played to. People were sort of were kind of essentially made to consider this on an individual basis. You know, would you, if you had no money at the end of the week, would you go for a pint or would you feed your child? And it sort of came down to those kind of arguments. And I wonder, from your perspective, those are really hard to battle against, or they can be sometimes really hard to create around your narrative, the argument that you want to sell.
Yes. Well, I think you've raised a very good point that the rhetoric behind this has been very, very carefully crafted, and it is very, very effective. And typically, more progressive voices and typically economists are not very good at rhetoric. So even though I think probably all the points that I made in my book had been made somewhere by somebody else, some economist somewhere had already said most of these things, they had not really expressed it simply and clearly in a way that somebody who's not studied economics and doesn't want to read a book about economics could actually understand. So I think you're absolutely right. There's this whole pile of rhetoric which culminates in a really powerful narrative which simply says it's unaffordable. So all the things that you might want to do, like funding the NHS properly, or repairing schools, or fixing roads, or building flood defences, or electrifying the electricity generation and tackling climate change, all of those desirable things, they simply say, oh, nobody would like to do it more than I would, but I'm afraid it's unaffordable. There just isn't the money, and somebody's got to be the grown-up in the room that says, no, we can't afford it. And it sounds so reasonable, especially if they're standing there in a smart suit and talking with a posh voice, and they say, I'm terribly sorry, but, you know, there is no magic money tree. Well, actually, there is literally not a tree where the notes grow, but we have a Bank of England, and all our money is created out of nothing. So there is, figuratively speaking, a magic money tree. The monetary system we have in this country and every other country in the world, I think now, is called a fiat money system. Fiat is the Latin word meaning let it be. And what that means is literally that the value is created out of nothing. So if you've got I don't know if you've got a wallet. Have you got a £10 note in that wallet?
Yeah.
So think about that £10 note. It was not very long ago just a piece of paper that was worth almost nothing. Mm-hmm. Then it had some ink put on it, and it's now worth £10. Where did the value of that, where did the value come from? Was it transferred from anywhere, or was it just created?
Well, it was created, really. It was just
created out of nothing.
Yeah.
So all the value of all the money that you've ever spent in your life has been created out of nothing. And, you know, we never hear politicians say that. It's been true since 1970 that we have had fiat money, and therefore it's all created out of nothing. But nobody ever says it, because if they keep saying it, people will say, well, in that case, why can't you create a bit more?
Well, yeah. It undermines the whole process, doesn't it? I suppose it undermines the whole process of money and currency, and it does happen, and we've seen it happen through quantitative easing.
Exactly.
But it's a very difficult. The point is, it's a very difficult thing to sell to people, because I can't foresee anybody being able to stand up to the country and say, guys, it's all good, we can just print some more money and build things. It's all fine. I mean, without sort of being laughed off. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. But the fact is, as you say, that we have done quite a lot of quantitative easing, which is not literally money printing because it's electronic, but it's basically money printing. So in this country, we have now had quantitative easing to the tune, I think, 645 billion pounds of quantitative easing has been done over the last few years. So all that money was created out of nothing, initially in order to enable the government to respond to the global financial crisis. So when it absolutely matters, nobody argues. Nobody says, oh, yes, we should just let the whole banking system collapse. We haven't got the money. They don't say, well, somebody's got to be the grown-up in the room. We're not going to save the banks, and therefore we're probably going to let the whole of British industry collapse as well. Nobody says that. They say, well, of course we can find the money. If we were at war, nobody would say, well, we can't afford to fight the war because we don't want to print any money to do it. We, of course, could fund a wartime effort. So when we really want to do it, we find out magically that we can do it, but the rest of the time we pretend that we can't.
Yeah, okay. So that's a reasonable argument, but then people will point to the often cited Venezuela in this case, or Zimbabwe previously as well, who have engaged in this kind of quantitative easing, and it has diluted their currency to a point of near financial ruin, really.
Yes. As it happens, the latest article on our website is precisely about that point. It's called Inflation Hysteria, and it looks at how worried people are about inflation, and particularly it looks at hyperinflation. And in fact, it's not the Venezuela incident that it mainly focuses on. It's the perhaps most famous one of all, which was the German hyperinflation of 1923. And the point that it makes in that article is that, in fact, in that case, but also in every other recorded case of hyperinflation, it's not just a question of printing money. It's a question of having some kind of supply shock that means you can't provide the goods and services that your population needs, and trying to fix that supply shock by printing money. And then that doesn't work. But if, like after the global financial crisis, there was no supply shock, there was actually a demand shock because people didn't have money, you can very easily fix that problem by printing money, which is why they did it. So you have to obviously use the right solution for the problem you have. Now, this coronavirus has caused a very unusual kind of recession, which is unlike any other recession that I've ever seen, because normally most recessions are actually a demand shock where you have some sort of financial retrenchment. People don't feel confident to spend. Some of them are supply shocks, like when we had the oil price shocks in the 1970s. But this one is really neither of those. This is something where we have asked people to stay home for reasons of public health, public safety, and so we have both reduced demand and reduced supply as a deliberate matter of choice. Mm-hmm. And the question is, well, how much economic damage is that going to do?
Yes.
Well, an interesting analogy is to think about what happens in France every August, or what happens in the Nordic countries every July, where essentially they shut down the economy. Everybody goes on holiday, and then they come back a month later and they start up again. Actually, there's essentially zero economic damage from that, because all the businesses are just mothballed, and so supply is not damaged, and people have chosen to go on holiday, but they don't normally bankrupt themselves by doing so, so when they get back, they can still afford to spend. So the demand side of the economy is also undamaged. And that's what our government should be thinking of. How do we make this a mothballing exercise so that after the virus is finished, it's just like France in September when everybody comes back after their August break? It's nothing more dramatic than that.
Sure. Okay.
Now, to be fair to them, actually, they haven't done too bad a job on that. They have protected businesses, not perfectly, but not too badly, and they have protected people's livelihoods through things like the furlough scheme, etc. So they could have done a much, much worse job. They could have done a better job, but they haven't done so far too bad a job in terms of looking at this as a mothballing exercise.
Sure. So just to track back there slightly then. So what you're saying is that your sort of model of quantitative easing, when people point at somewhere like Venezuela, it requires there being demand following that quantitative easing, and ultimately, in this case, it does seem there is that pent-up demand ready to go and ready to kind of keep the economy
quantitative easing can help a bit with both sides of this. If you let a lot of businesses go bankrupt now, then you won't have the capability to supply afterwards. And that actually would increase the risk of inflation after the crisis ends if you had mass bankruptcies.
Sure.
So you could helpfully spend a bit of money now stopping businesses going bankrupt. That looks after the supply side. And on the demand side, if you stop households going bankrupt, then they will still have money to spend after the crisis, and the demand will also be intact, and therefore it will be a bit like France after the August holiday.
Sure. It's a sensible argument you make, Mark, and it does fly in the face of what is a very, very powerful narrative on the other side. Just very briefly, because we're out of time, Mark, but how confident are you that there is the political will, and also probably more to the point, the political characters to make your vision a reality in the coming years? Well,
as of today, I'm not sure there is the political will, and that's, you mentioned at the beginning that I've set up this 99% organisation, and the aim of that organisation is to help to build that political will, to help to make sure that as many people as possible understand the numbers, the facts, as well as having heard the rhetoric. And that includes politicians. You know, not all politicians fully understand this, so we want to help the vast majority of politicians are not market fundamentalists and would find this extremely beneficial.
Okay. Mark, it's a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Your books are really interesting. Regardless of where you sit in the debate, I think it's always worth hearing other voices. Can you point people in the direction of your books?
Yes, it's called 99% Mass Impoverishment and How We Can End It, and you can get it from all good bookshops. Mark,
thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Mark Thomas with us this morning, author and business leader. Your take on that is really welcome. 0344 499 1000. Some big issues being grappled with there. I appreciate, but hey, if you can't do that at this time in the morning on Talk Radio, when can you do it? Hey, that's what we're here for. These big conversations.